Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. When many people study biblical scholarship, some lose their testimony in the scriptures. Is that always the case? I asked that question to Colby Townsend, a biblical scholar at Indiana University, and he'll answer that question. I was a bit surprised by his answer. Check out our conversation.
So, do we try to reconcile that? Do we say, oh, maybe Lehi left later? I don't know.
I don't know. That's one of those things where I kind of alluded to earlier, where a lot of time people will be like, okay, you've just sort of come in and smashed up this wall. Now you need to put it back up together. Put it together for me.
Yeah. How do we pick up our pieces of faith, knowing all this then?
Right. Well, and so that's where I say that coming as a historian to this study, I can't really do that for you. That's really up to individuals, and there are a handful of other scholars. Joe Spencer is a good friend of mine, and I've always sort of suggested, go to him. He's a good theologian, and he'll help you sort of go through and figure some of that out. But coming at it really from the outside, really as a historian, and trying to study and understand the history of the texts. That's just not something that I really do, I guess. So, yeah.
So you can't help us out, huh?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, for me, I think that Bill Davis has really done a good service recently in his book.
I've not read it. I have his book. It's on my very large stack of books to read.
Right, yeah. You should move that one to the top. In Bill's book, listeners will hopefully get a copy of that. It's pretty cheap in paperback.
Yeah.
But he looks at the influence of performance, so oral culture, sort of theater, that kind of stuff, on the way that Joseph Smith dictated the Book of Mormon. So while that might complicate some assumptions about the traditional dating, at least in whole, of the Book of Mormon, he never says that the Book of Mormon is not historical, or it is historical, or it's anything else, right? He goes through and he analyzes that information, and he leaves open the possibility for each individual person to sort of construct their own belief around the new information that he's provided to understand the text.
From what I understand, I know Brian Hales, he's been big on polygamy, but his new project is, there's no way Joseph could have wrote this by himself. That it had to be a miracle. And it sounds like Bill is like, well, there was a lot of stuff around here that Joseph could have put something together like this. And I kind of get that feeling from your paper as well. Yeah. So, are you of the opinion that there were, Joseph was great at synthesizing Masonry and Adam Clark's commentary and all of this stuff? In particular, Adam Clark's commentary,
for me, I've continued working on lots of different projects and continuing my research since I finished the master's thesis last year, and I can't say too much about it, but I have found that Smith was using Adam Clark prior to his revision of the New Testament, and it wasn't with the Bible revision, but he was using it in 1829, and that played a significant role in the dictation process of the Book of Mormon.
Oh, really?
And I'll be publishing on that soon as well.
Wow.
And so, those kinds of things. I don't want to diminish the important work that any more devotionally minded individual would want to put toward understanding the Book of Mormon. That's not my place. I think that plays a significant role in it. Guys like Brian Hales and others ask important questions that help to further along scholarship. But at the same time, I would hope that those individuals would also take a little bit of humility in the way that they explain and discuss scholarship on the Book of Mormon. Just scholars and academic work in general. A lot of the time, there tends to be this sort of push against it by saying, oh, well, they don't really know what they're talking about, or they forgot this one very ultra-specific thing that I'm actually misunderstanding. And that totally destroys their whole argument. For those of us who are engaged in this, we're trying to approach it as humbly as possible, right? We're not, writing on the Book of Mormon or writing on the Bible isn't going to get me a cushy, career position, right? It's already, especially right now during the coronavirus and the economic downturn and everything. Before this, it was already difficult enough to get an academic
it's
job,
make it worse.
right?
So, if you want to make money, don't go into Mormon studies,
right?
In academia or anywhere else.
Yeah. So for those of us like Bill,
even podcasting.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you might end up spending more than than you had planned. Yeah. But for those of us like Bill and myself and just dozens and dozens of others, we're really just trying to employ our expertise and the massive amount of hours that we spend really going through and engaging with the sources, engaging with broader literature. I'm basically a part of at least 3 different fields where I'm engaging with books from that entire range. So like biblical studies, I've been reading for the last decade, early American history, Mormon studies, religious studies more broadly speaking, literary criticism more broadly speaking. I'm working with all of those different fields to bring this kind of research. I say in my master's thesis that this is an interdisciplinary study. Mm-hmm. It's not just one field or one discipline. I'm trying to engage with all these different areas. So I would hope that dialogue and conversation from those who are not specialists in the area would be a little bit more kind than just simply writing off the work that we feel that is important, the kinds of things that we're finding.
That's the easiest thing to do, isn't it?
Right. It is, yeah.
Just don't pay attention to them.
Yeah. Well, just for an example, I wasn't really planning on getting into this, but just for an example, the idea that Smith was illiterate. That's one that's thrown around quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, all of his critics and everybody that knew him said that he was illiterate, so he couldn't have done that. Emma Smith said that he couldn't dictate a well-worded letter, at the time.
Right.
The problem with that is twofold.
And didn't know that there was a wall around Jerusalem. He didn't know the Bible.
Yes, exactly, yeah. So the problem with all of that is really kind of twofold. For one, they're uncritically engaging with the interviews. For one, Emma said that he couldn't dictate a coherent letter. He not only wrote good letters right at that time, and we still have them, he dictated extremely good letters, revelations, in the Doctrine and Covenants, a handful of others that weren't ever printed, that are now in the Joseph Smith papers. But so we know for a fact that he was good at dictating. We know for a fact that he could individually by himself write his own letters, and at that exact same period. But even further, what it meant to be illiterate in early America, particularly the early American Republic, is not what it means today. Today we have this very defined, if you're illiterate, you can't read and write. But in early America, to be literate meant far more than reading and writing. Pretty much everybody in early America, it was a very tiny minority besides African American slaves that couldn't read. It was a religious duty in early America. The Puritans in the early colonies were the most literate areas in the world up to that point. So that was significant. But everyone learned how to read first, and then you learned how to write. That was the curriculum in school. And and there are a handful of books on this. I'm actually reading one right now. When someone would say that, oh, well, that person's illiterate, that didn't mean they couldn't read or write. It didn't mean anything like that. It meant they weren't cultured. It meant that they didn't understand history. It meant that they didn't understand literature.
So when we say
they didn't have the training.
Was illiterate, he was uncultured, is really what that means?
He was uncultured, he was unlearned.
But you're saying he could read and write just fine?
We know he could. He had a good handwriting. His signature, if you look at it during that period, he wrote it in his journal. There are lots of examples of his own writing. He had good handwriting. The problem for Smith was not that he couldn't read or write. He could. We have empirical evidence of that. He was not illiterate in the sense that we use today. He was a good storyteller, all of that. He was a good speaker. He was charismatic. The problem for him was that I don't know if it was his attention span or his interests or what, but he could speak. He didn't want to write. I think his mind went faster than his hand. And so he was able to speak and have someone else write and catch up and keep up with him, which is interesting too, related to another paper I have. There's evidence in Moses 1 in particular, but in the earliest manuscript of the Book of Moses, Emma was writing a portion of that manuscript. And it's really clear that she added punctuation after she wrote. So she would write and go back really quick and then put punctuation and write and then put punctuation, which suggests that she was writing and trying to keep up with Smith as he was speaking. So Smith would speak at a certain speed as he was thinking. But I honestly think that he didn't like writing because he couldn't keep up with his mind. So he could dictate, he could think, he was a good thinker. Many of his contemporaries, some of the kids who grew up with him, who in the 1830s were asked about their experiences growing up with him, said that he was a good thinker. He was in a debate club, and he was a good debater. And whenever they would sort of get into a sticky area, he was always the one that would sort of get them out of it. So he actually is smart. He was literate in our sense today, but as far as the early 19th century, unlearned, uncultured, unaware of history, all of that was the sense of being illiterate that Smith was being accused of.
See, now I want to push back on that for just a little bit, because I remember I talked with Michael Quinn, and he said that in the early 1830s, Joseph was a terrible public speaker, and Sidney Rigdon was just fantastic.
Sure.
And he actually mentioned that people talked about how pathetic, that's the word, pathetic Joseph Smith was. And now I've had some other people argue with that pathetic meant something different. But Quinn at least was like, he was a terrible man.
If you're comparing him to Sidney Rigdon, sure. Like Sidney Rigdon was known and had experience and training for being a good public speaker. Smith was a little bit more timid, I think, and that definitely played into that. But as far as him being able to get excited and to dictate a new revelation, to dictate the Book of Mormon, he could do that.
So he was literate. So you're saying that we should not refer to Smith as being illiterate?
Not in our modern sense.
Right.
And if you are going to point to the criticisms of Smith in the early 19th century of him as being illiterate, you can't just sort of bring in our baggage from now to then. There are whole books on that. I'm trying to remember her name right now. I'll have to get that to you. But it's empowering. Is it empowering authorship? Empowering words? But this book, the author, she looks at outsider authorship from about 1760 to 1815, and she talks about that problem of being illiterate, because most of the people that she looks at would have been considered illiterate by the broader society, and a lot of them were called illiterate, but clearly they weren't. A lot of them were producing texts every year. They were publishing books one after another. They were publishing broadsides or small pamphlets or whatever else. Phyllis Wheatley, super famous early African-American female poet. She would have been considered illiterate. But we know her because of all of the publications that came out from her.
So when we think of illiterate, we should just think uncultured.
Something like that.
That would be better.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Untrained, unschooled, unrefined, something like that.
All right. Well, is there anything we've missed?
I don't know.
On your thesis that we need to
I think we've covered mostly everything.
Your award-winning thesis.
Thank you. Too kind. Yeah.
Well, I was there when they announced it, so I thought that was pretty exciting. So,
yeah. It was a good surprise. But Yeah, no, I don't think so. Just that, Smith's early texts are all connected in lots of ways that haven't really been pointed out yet, in a systematic way in scholarship on early Mormonism. So there's a lot of new avenues to go about that kind of work, and a lot of new things that I'm hoping to get out there and engage with other scholars and lay readers and see what everybody thinks.
All right. Well, Colby Townsend, I hope you enjoy your time in Big Ten country with Indiana.
Thank you.
I'll miss you. It's been great seeing you at all these conferences, but I guess we're still friends on Facebook. So.
Yeah, and I'm sure I'll make it back every once in a while. So, yeah.
Well, great. Well, thanks again for being on Gospel Tangents. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Rick.
Mm-hmm. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Colby Townsend. Colby, good luck on your studies there in Indiana. And hope everything goes well, and hope to have you back on the show sometime. So if you're interested in checking out his award-winning thesis, go to tinyurl.com/Colby, and there's a link that you can download it for free at the Utah State website. So thanks again, Colby. I really appreciate it. In our next conversation, I'd like to introduce Dr. Taylor Petrie. We're going to talk about his new book, Tabernacles of Clay, and we're going to jump from the ancient past to the present day. We're going to talk about why LDS leaders had misgivings about interracial marriage.
But when I started looking at the conversations that were happening and what church leaders were saying about race in the 50s and 60s, I saw immediately that marriage was one of the big concerns. Why were they in favor of segregation? Why did they oppose civil rights? Why did they even have church policies that would prevent marriage in the temple? Because they were really concerned about interracial sex, right? They thought that this was a big problem.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents. And for just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview without any interruption. If you'd like a paperback version of our transcripts, go to Amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview. Also, if you'd like to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website, and I'll be able to send you a transcript as soon as they are completed, and click the subscribe button. You can also find our latest information on Facebook.com/GospelTangents, as well as we're on Twitter @GospelTangents. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The link is at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, and you can subscribe there. Also, please give us a 5-star review. If you want to support all of the podcasts as part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, go to lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, and do a search for Dialogue Podcast Network or Gospel Tangents, because, that's a pretty cool one too. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.